Today on PhotoKitchen, we're talking non-destructive workflows and best practices to prevent overcooking your images. Hello and welcome to episode number 73 of PhotoKitchen. I am your humble host, MD Welch, and today we are talking about non-destructive workflows in your post-processing process. That's, I guess, the best way to say it. What we're going to discuss in this video is best ways to edit your images without having to go back and do a lot of work if you have to make changes to those edits. And that is really the heart of a non-destructive workflow. So first, before we talk about the non-destructive process, we need to discuss what is the non-destructive process. And it's actually pretty straightforward, and it might even be something you're doing already, even if you don't know what it is. To demonstrate this, I'm going to actually hop over to Photoshop because this is where a lot of destructive editing can happen. So I just want to demonstrate this so you can kind of see the logic behind this. I have a folder here or a group with two adjustment layers in it. And these adjustment layers are essentially handling the black and white conversion of the file. These adjustment layers are non-destructive. That's how they're built. That was the beauty of adjustment layers when they were introduced in Photoshop CS or something like that years ago. Might even be decades now, to be honest with you. But now I could come into these adjustment layers. I could turn them off individually. I could turn them back on. I could double click on them. I could make adjustments to their actual settings. I could reduce opacity. I could make changes to blending modes. There's a lot of possibilities here. And the beauty is at no particular point am I stuck with that setting. It is non-destructive. And that's really what non-destructive means, is the ability to go back and kind of change any property of your image at any particular time in the least amount of time possible. And that is huge, especially if you're working in some sort of field of photography where you're working with clients or coworkers and they're making changes to files and you got to go back and you got to make those subtle changes for them. You don't want to spend hours doing that. You need to lean on a non-destructive workflow. Now, if I hop back over to Capture One, and I'm using Capture One for this demonstration, but this also applies to Lightroom, Lightroom Classic, actually any raw editing program. These programs are inherently non-destructive. Raw editing programs like Capture One and the Lightroom family, they offer you the ability to edit your images, but also give you the ability to go back and make changes at any particular time. So in the case of these files here, I could come in and change the base color or come in, turn it on and off the color grade. I have also the ability to turn on and off the contrast and also make adjustments to them. Now, Capture One has layers, Lightroom Classic has masks. Both are essentially the same thing, and they offer you the ability to make these changes. And you could also go into individual panels and shift, say, your white balance or something like that. So you could come in at any time and tweak the file as much as you want to, and there's no destructive process, there's no pixels lost, anything like that. This is ideal, right? So Lightroom, Lightroom Classic, and of course, as you see here, Capture One, they are all working inherently in a non-destructive workflow. And if you are working in those programs, okay, good, you're already in the non-destructive process. But what happens if you have to leave these programs and go into a pixel editing program? That's really what Photoshop is. Photoshop is a pixel-based editing or bitmap or raster editing program. And while I love what Capture One and Lightroom do, let's be honest, they still don't do retouching and they certainly don't do compositing like Photoshop does and some of these other programs that compete with Photoshop. So how do you handle this? Well, there's two actual real methods to this, and I'm going to show you both because I do both. Now, in this picture of my friend Grace, shot on a very cold day in Northern California at a kind of a small airport, I have already done all of the work to the original image. So if I give you a before and after here, and I show you what the original file looked like, this is out of camera, and I just used Capture One, and I used all the tools that it had, and I brought the image to where I wanted it to be. Then I took this file and went into Photoshop and just did some blemish work, filled in maybe a few little lines, took away some flyaway hairs, nothing fancy. But all of the editing was done inside of Photoshop, and then I am able to export out of Capture One or Lightroom or whatever like that with the original PSD. And I work in the PSD file format, as you can see down here. So it leaves Capture One, goes into Photoshop as a PSD format, and I make my editing, and that's great. Now, while this is a really nice workflow, the problem with it is what happens if Grace in this particular case comes back and says, hey, MD, I really like what you've done, but I wish it wasn't as warm, or I wish it was cooler, or something like that. Can you make the changes? Well, I can come into Capture One and of course make some sort of changes. So let's just make this cooler on the request of Grace's fictional request, right? And I make it cooler. The problem is all of the editing that I did inside of Photoshop is not going to carry over into the PSD. So these changes, these edits don't carry over, and I'm basically now going to have to go into Photoshop, delete this PSD file, or maybe save as a different thing, create a new PSD based on this new cooler edit, and do all of my retouching there. This can be problematic. And I would say this workflow is good for those photographers that you're doing your own editing, you're going in the direction that you want to, you don't have final approval from a client, an art director, a subject, what have you. You have the final say in this process. Now, if we hop over to another image where I did the exact opposite, you can see here that I'm shooting my friend Marty in the studio here. This is the original file. And if I do a before and after here, you'll see that both images actually change. In the case of the camera raw on the left-hand side, all that I did is I went into Photoshop, I filled in the backdrop, and I did some basic retouching, some blemish removal, and that is what it resulted in the PSD on the left-hand side. Now from there, inside of Capture One, I did all sorts of stuff. I added contrast, I did multiple layers, I had a lot of adjustments here. I did additional color changes, contrast settings, and also I did an overall color grade. And I did this all internally inside of Capture One to the PSD file. And by the way, you could do this inside of Lightroom and Lightroom Classic. It is just a different workflow. Now, the pros of this is if I was shooting this for, say, a agency or lifestyle, editorial, fashion publication, whatever, and all of a sudden they come back and they go, well, we don't like that orange. Can you go back to yellow? We saw yellow on the set. We want yellow. We want it just to be a brighter yellow. Okay, I can immediately go into that PSD now and do all of those edits in Capture One without opening up Photoshop, which is a very fast way and efficient way to work. It's fantastic. And it is a great workflow if you're not the final say in the process, because it is so much faster to work in programs like Lightroom and Capture One, especially if you had 5 images that all had this exact same adjustment. You could select all 5, adjust them all at the exact same time. It's so much faster to do this in a camera raw editing program. So you might be asking yourself, well, then why don't you do what you did here on the other image? The problem is the image on the right-hand side is camera raw. It has all of the raw potential. So every time they update software, we just get more and more potential to edit these images. If you open up a camera raw file that you shot maybe 10 or 12 years ago and re-edit it, you will find that you can do more now than you could 10 or 15 years ago. We know more what we could do with the sensors, the software gets better, and the potential gets better. That also means that there's just more leverage to work with these images. If I jump back over to the Grace image here and do the before, you could see that it was severely backlit and she's kind of underexposed. I don't have detail in the hair and so forth. If I was to leave Capture One here with the image looking this way, retouch it in Photoshop, and then come back and then try to make those fixes, I'm working on a PSD file here. And if I edit this, and I'll show you how I edit inside of Capture One, leaving it, I leave Capture One in a PSD format in 16-bit mode, in the Pro Photo color space. Now, this is the biggest color space with the biggest bit depth possible, but it's still less information than the original camera raw file, meaning that my ability to make fixes could be limited when I come back in and edit the PSD file. So then what is the best way to proceed coming out of a raw editing program and into a pixel or raster editing program like Photoshop or Photoshop's competitors? Honestly, I think it really involves, first of all, who is the final say in the creative process? And also, what does your original image look like? In the case of the studio shot with Marty, the original image is just slightly darker than I wanted it to be. You could see here, I did do a little bit of a base exposure adjustment before I went into Photoshop. And I would say on this image and also on the previous image of Grace, because it is very backlit and underexposed in the original, that you probably want to get your base tonality, that's your brightness, darkness, your base contrast, that's also tonality, white balance, that kind of stuff at an acceptable level before you proceed into, say, a Photoshop pixel editing raster-based program. But I would then probably lean on those programs to do all of your color grading, all of your additional contrast work, any maybe local lighting adjustments, because those are probably going to be the things that clients will push back on. If you are doing only personal work and you know what you want at the start, you just have a lot more information editing all of this stuff as a raw file first before you do your retouching inside of Photoshop. So it really probably comes down to how good is the original image and also who has final say. If you don't have final say, I would try to lean on the raw editing programs as much as possible. So with that out of the way, let's just hop over to Photoshop really quick and talk about workflow once you're in this program, because this is where I see a lot of people when they're first starting off retouching make a lot of mistakes here. So I'm going to turn off this black and white group here. We'll come back to that in just 1 second. And I want to walk you through my workflow. And this is nothing fancy. This is no plugins. I'm not selling you anything. This is very straightforward stuff. When I do retouching of any image, I start with 2 empty or brand new layers. And you could go up to layer on the menu bar, come down and do new. There's all these different ways to do it. There's keyboard shortcuts. You could do it through the layers panel. This is just one of those ways. And I make these layers and I name them to start off with. And always rename your layers, kids, always. So I rename these layers. I call one retouch and I call the other one texture. I have 2 layers for retouching here. One thing I will say is I do have an action that does this. And it's a really simple action to make. Just make the layers, hit record, make the layers, and hit stop, and you're done. But I have my first layer retouching. So this is, if I hide all my other layers, this is just fixing any sort of flyaway hairs, any blemishes, anything like that, camera dust issues, those kinds of things. In this case, there was like, you could see here, if I zoom in a little bit, there was a whole bunch of things like just little like dust, dog hair, and that kind of stuff on the jeans. So all of that stuff was taken care of. It was just removed. And it just improves the overall image. Now, the texture layer, which I didn't have to do to my friend Bridget here, is reserved for when we have more age-related texture-based issues, filling in those things. And you know what I'm talking about here. And the benefit of doing it in a separate layer is that you could then come into the opacity setting and just reduce the opacity setting inside the layers panel and bring back some of that texture. So somebody doesn't look like their face is made of plastic or some terrible Botox mistake or something like that. You can have a little bit of realism while still being flattering to your subject. And you could kind of play around with that opacity setting. And the benefit of this is by separating both, you have separated blemishes for more age-related texture kind of based things, and then you could adjust them appropriately. Now, the reason to do everything in a brand new blank layer is because then if you make a mistake, and I'll go back into retouch here, everything is in its own layer. So if you've made a mistake, you could grab the eraser tool and just erase away from any of these issues and bring back the original underlying layer here. This retouch layer, this texture layer, it's not bonded to the original layer. You're not stuck with your changes. Again, it's just going to make life a lot faster. Now, when you do this workflow, you do have to set up the tools in Photoshop beforehand. The good news is you usually only have to do this once. And when I say once, it's usually once per install on a computer. Sometimes when you update from an old version of Photoshop to a new version of Photoshop, your preferences carry over, but it's not a bad idea to check. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through my retouching tools here. I'll start with the spot healing brush. For this to work in a non-destructive workflow, i.e. working in these empty layers, you need to have sample all layers checked. If you don't, you have to work in the original layer. That is a terrible idea. I think we've already covered why that's a terrible idea enough. So have that checked. For the healing brush, it's a little bit different. You want the sample to be set to current and below. Stay away from all layers. And the reason why you want to stay away from all layers is because it will just retouch in your layer and sample from everything underneath. You should always do your retouching first. Then you should do global editing and then specialized or local editing next. So that's how I've kind of done this. I have my black and white retouching layer up here done. And the benefit of having current and below is if I do some sort of sample, it will sample just from what's underneath this particular layer. However, if I set this to all layers, and this is also true of Clone Stamp, which we'll see in a second. If I come into here and let's select, do an option click on the shoe here and do a new shoe on the beach. Now there's going to be a little bit of color blending mode here, changeover, but you'll see this. And if all of a sudden I turn off the black and white, you could see that the change is still in black and white where the rest of the image is in color because it's sampling all layers. So you want it to be set to current and below. That way, if you forget to turn off adjustment layers, it doesn't hurt you at all. So, and of course, the beauty of this is I could switch over to the eraser tool since this is done in an empty layer and just erase all of that away. For the patch tool, Same idea as the spot healing brush, you just have sample all layers checked. Do take note that both of these tools do sample all layers. So this is another reason to try to do all of your retouching first. And then do all of your adjusting second, especially if you are deciding to do significant adjustments inside of Photoshop. This could end up hurting you. So get your editing out of the way, or your retouching out of the way first. That covers the big ones as far as the different healing tools there. For clone stamp, it's just like the regular healing brush. You want that to be set to current and below. And again, do all of your work in these empty layers. Do it before you do any sort of image enhancement, any global editing, and your life will be a heck of a lot easier in the long run. And also, it'll be a lot easier when clients or art directors call you up and say, hey, we just noticed this, or we don't like that, or the client itself has not approved the black and white conversion. In this case, you can just open up Photoshop and turn this layer off and you're done. If you had done black and white conversions over in Capture One, it is a lot easier to do that in a Camera Raw editing program. I discussed that in another video, and I'll include the link to that in the comments section. Speaking of comment sections, I'd love to hear about your editing process. Are you already in a non-destructive workflow? Is this brand new information for you? If you are in a non-destructive workflow, is there anything that you're doing differently? How do you work with plugins, those kinds of things? Also, if you haven't done so already, please hit the like button, and thanks for making it this far in the video. Subscribe to the channel, and please share this information with your other friends in the photography field. So until next time, I am MD Welch, wishing you all the best from PhotoKitchen.